My friends, let's start with the watercolor. Let's first wet the paper using a wide flat brush, the whole sheet. Wet it evenly, especially the corners because they dry first. Next, I take a smaller flat brush and mix color for the background. I want a pigment that contains white to make the mix more opaque. If you don't have such pigments, you can add white to your paint. I mix Horizon Blue and start to act confidently, making a wash. We can add a colder tone, a more sky tone color. In my case, it's Verditer Blue. You can add Ultramarine. Don't be shy here and act boldly with bright and saturated colors. We can add cerulean a bit lower, but not too abruptly. I take quite a saturated color. I want to make it whiter. The pigment must be dense, that's why I add white watercolor pigment. I first dreaded this moment. I thought white didn't belong in watercolor, but we add this pigment to transparent mixes. Watercolor remains watercolor at this point, it just becomes more opaque and less flowing. We need this to add waves. Okay, we've finished this piece of the wash. It will wait a couple of seconds. I take a different brush, wet it and squeeze out the water, and I mix the color for waves. It can be cerulean, phthalo blue, a little green. In the distance, it all should have white pigment. It can be Horizon Blue in the distance, because it all starts to get lighter, dry in the distance, become more stable. So we should paint little, thin, barely visible waves in the distance. Again, try to avoid dense groups of waves. And avoid empty spaces too. Don't forget about the edges of the sheet. Use just the tip of the brush and again remember the movement. We lightly touch the paper, then press harder and release. I want to add more green in the foreground, maybe cobalt green, phthalo green, but just a little tone, not much. Take a closer look. It's not fierce green yet, it's background. Everything should be calm there. I would say delicate. We can use a fan brush and blur if something is too sharp. I use it horizontally in horizontal movements in order to intensify the plasticity of the waves, emphasize their horizontal position. This way the strokes will be more delicate and prolongated. Some water accumulated here. We can brush it. I add phthalo green. The place on top of the wave where it starts to dry, I add a little stroke. See where you need it in your case. We intensify just a little and continue to move downwards. Here's a beautiful flow of paint that happened here. Nothing to worry about. If you look closely, the boat should be darker in this place anyway. So maybe I'll make it even lighter here. Having squeezed the brush first, I go over it. And I continue to paint the waves. It's a very meditative, relaxing process. Don't worry, you'll have time for everything. If you panic, it will be the opposite. You risk to miss it. But if you relax, everything will work out just perfect. The background is starting to dry, so better not touch it. See the level of wetness in your particular case. My paper is quite wet, so it will take much time to dry. We continue the wash. I now start to paint with cobalt green. It means more turquoise. You can add phthalo green. Note how turquoise the color is under the boat. It's even greenish. Don't be afraid and take this color that you see. I feel that everyone can see this color and show it. Of course, a lot depends on the paint. I use Mugello paint especially because they're very saturated. Of course, no one pays me for advertising it. For some reason, I started using these paints and now I can't make do without them. Other artists have calmer colors and tones in their palette. Some focus more on the composition. I myself love colors. I always feel the need for them. And so I aspire to show it in my works. We can even add ultramarine in some spots, here in the light and in the shadows. Let's cover more. The closer to us, the more visible the bottom of the sea, and there is more green. I also add Naples yellow. Horizon blue. I continue to do quite wet wash, but at the same time, white pigment will make it opaque. We're approaching the stones. Interesting things are about to happen. I've added cool gray to increase opacity of this color. Now we need to be very attentive to see what is shown in the reference. We don't see the waves themselves, we start to see what's beneath them. So, we mix ultramarine, we can take cobalt blue, and we'll act off the spots under the boat. Look what greenish and turquoise tones there are. The spots are intricate in shape, and between them there are interesting shining lines. They are rays of light playing on the surface of the stones, refracting when they pass through water. We'll need to work fast and efficiently now. We're now painting what we see underwater. Note what spots you see. Everyone will see them differently. You don't have to copy off the reference, but watch the tendency it has. What do you see? Some of these spots are darker. We can add phthalo blue or even indigo in some areas. Don't get carried away here. We need to do one more interesting thing before this all dries. We leave these shining lines, so we don't paint them, but we go around them and paint the negative space. We can start to show the stones here. Shadows under the stones. We can even add violet tone there. Payne's grey. Green tones. Okay, let's finish with this bit. Now I take a Ruger brush again. A thin brush. I dip it in water, squeeze it, but it's a little wet. And I'll show these shining lines. The paper should be a little dry. The pigment is already sinking into the paper. You see, I've started here, and this bloom turned out too big. I'm going to correct it. And here you see that water pushes the pigment, just like here, but it's just too much. We can correct it with a dry brush or a fan brush and continue. I'll add some spots here. I'm working with a clean brush without pigment, but with water. These lines will be more sharp if your paper is more dry. I mean, it won't work on a very dry paper. It should settle, which means the pigment has sunk into the paper, and then you can start doing these beautiful rays of light underwater. They go along the shape of the stones, so it means that the places where you see these stones, you see these beautiful lines on them. You can tell the level of wetness of your paper by its glistening, and where it doesn't glisten anymore, like here, you see, it doesn't work that well. We need a matte tone. The paper shouldn't be too wet, otherwise the lines won't appear. It's still wet here, for example, because the paper was watered well. So it works like this. It doesn't make much sense adding details here in the shadow. I showed you a little, but actually we should focus more on the areas around the shadow, because we'll do the shadow again in the second layer on dry. Let's show it here. The important thing is to understand and prepare your tools, the wetness level of your paper, and you'll succeed. I think we've showed enough here, and we can stop. Add a few concluding strokes. You see, it doesn't wipe well here. The paper is almost dry. We still have time to do something under the boat, and then we must move on. We don't stay long in one place so that the paper doesn't dry. We are moving on, we'll come back here. The bottom is becoming calmer in tone. We can add Naples yellow, ochre, even orange for some warmth. Some elements. Again, we try to make the wash as wet as possible and continue. You see it hasn't dried yet, so we can kind of stretch the wash further downwards. We apply the main tone. I remind you it should contain white pigment. It can be present in your paint, and if you don't have such paint, you can add white pigment yourself. But it should be watercolor, preferably watercolor pigment. We use medium tone. We'll paint shadows from the stones over it, so it should be medium. And glints. They should be visible against this background. It should be like this, a complex color. Some places warmer and others colder. I'm painting it in different tones. It shouldn't be all the same. I feel it's starting to dry here. We'll need to move on nice and easy. I want to show shadows using dark tone, shadows from stones, using just the tip of the brush. Not that I'm not painting the stones themselves, but the space under them, shadows. I add Payne's Grey, Indigo, some green, phthalo green. Look at the reference, you'll see that under every stone there is a different tone. Some shadows are actually green, some are cold, bluish. So we're painting these things. Dark spots. I sometimes add maroon for more contrast. I like to make these shadows using ultramarine, indigo, more stones here. Here in the light, where the glints shine, we can make shadows softer and warmer in color. The transition is too sharp here, and it's dried. So we can blur it a bit, make our wash smooth here, show some stones. Note how these spots are distributed in the reference. A few dark spots, and they turned into stone. We can add yellow, not Naples yellow, just cadmium yellow, that gives warm tone. A little orange, ochre, and I show these warm stones here. Mid-tones, some warmer and some colder. It's okay. We should also show mid-tones, not just shadows. There's always mid-tone above the shadow. We can show it with violet color, a complex color. A little orange. Let's show this corner fast while it's wet. We'll need to act fast to have time to show the rays. Our beautiful rays that add charm to our work. We can paint smaller stones in the foreground. Make them smaller, but paint them in more detail. So we don't paint the stones, we paint the outline and the shadow. I'll add a few strokes to the shadows. I mix cobalt and ultramarine. I go over the darkest areas. I add a little violet tone. Our stones, shadows here, and smaller stones on the bottom. I'll blur the areas with too much contrast. I want to add a couple strokes to intensify the shadows under the stones, but not everywhere. We'll also need to show light areas. I take a rigger brush again, dip it in water, squeeze a little so that it's not too wet, otherwise the drop will be too big and it will spread. And now I show them. The light glints. They'll flow nicely on moist paper without our help, and they'll shine beautifully on the surface. It doesn't work where the paper is still too wet, but where it has dried a little, that's where it will work. And the lines will be slightly blurry and white. It doesn't make sense to paint them over shadows. They don't overlap with shadows. You need to be attentive and observing to notice it. I feel like adding some accents here in the center. More information about the stones. This edge is too sharp. I blur this edge with a white flat brush, if it works, of course. I've added a line in the shadow. It's still wet here, so we can adjust the shapes of the shadows. We continue to work on the light lines using a moist trigger brush. They also have their own plasticity. Notice how they look. If you've wetted it too much, you can dab it with a tissue. Let's continue. We work around the shape of the stones. I don't press the brush much. You can press sometimes and it will work like wiping. It also works. If you don't have a rigger brush, you can wipe with the tip of a brush. But I'm making these lines because the synthetic rigger brush loses water and this line of water pushes the pigment. This means I don't even wipe, it's water that pushes the pigment. It's long trace. That's what's working. We can wipe in some areas. In this case, you'll need a tissue at hand and a clean brush every time. You see, wiping works better on wetter areas, and if the paper has dried a little, it works better if you apply these water lines. Try different ways. Maybe you won't succeed the first time. You need to keep balance of wetness, feel watercolor. Anyway, you will have some understanding of how to do it, and you'll be doing it better with every try. We'll soon need to stop and let it dry. There's bottom. We go back to the boat. We can wipe here. There is a reef of stones. The shining lines go along the shapes. I'll be finishing with it now. It's really hard to stop. It's a very engaging process. Painting water is engaging in general. And you enjoy it much more when you know how to do it right. I'll leave it at this. I'll check the boat and apply main tone to it. I'll take ultramarine or cobalt blue, a little quinacridone, and some kind of tone in the shadows here. It's greenish, we can use it. It's a complex color. I cover the boat. We could have wetted it beforehand, but if you paint the wash quickly, then you don't have to do it. Careful. The wash is still wet and we can intensify it. There are many spots with reflected light on the boat coming from water, from reflected light. So we can add horizon blue, green tones. I want to make it darker, closer to the edge, and the spots with reflected light will be here. I want to make it warmer in tone, closer to the front. I feel like adding warm colors. They'll contrast nicely with the water. I want to use cobalt green further from us. And make such transition. And also edge contrast, it should be darker, closer to the edge. Here we intensify it confidently. We continue to intensify the tone if the boat doesn't look prominent enough. Here, for example, it asks for intensifying. This way it becomes noticeable and doesn't blend with water. Something like this. We can cover the inner parts now too. I'll take a calligraphy brush mix a complex maroon color. We can even add vermilion or poppy red, because the boat is red inside. And these red tones will look very contrasting and expressive against all this green. If you prefer to use calmer tones, then you don't have to add red. I add a little red tones to this wash, and they will flow there. Overall, this color should be dark. I'll go around here, onto the bench. The bench has thickness. I'll leave some white paper and go back to it later, using pink color. The sides of the bench have pink reflected light, if you look at the photo. For now, I'll show a dark spot and add some red tones here. We can also cover this part of the boat. I've taken a rather dark color, I'll make it lighter, because it's the side part and it's in the shade. Great, and let's show the shadow here, so that the bench remains light and everything else steps back. I think we can leave our work to dry. And we'll continue to adjust details after it's completely dry.